Thank you very much for that speech. We now turn to the final speaker for the opposition, and indeed the final speaker for this evening, Dame Karen Pierce. Dame Karen Pierce is the British ambassador to the USA. Prior to this, she served as the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York from 2018. She's held many different positions since joining the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, including the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan and chief operating officer of the FCO. You have the ears of the House.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. It's a real honour to be here, and I've served 3 times at the UN. I've worked on the Balkans, I've worked on Afghanistan, which fundamentally depend on the Security Council to help bring those awful conflicts to an end. So I guess all this is on me. So I'll do my best. Your arguments would have more force for the proposition if you had mentioned Russian use of chemical weapons in Syria. They would have more force if you would acknowledge that the reason nothing was done in Rwanda was not a veto.
About the bioweapons.
What about them? What about them?
After 10 years from the alleged chemical weapons were used, there was new studies that showed that it wasn't the Syrian government or the Russian government that actually did the chemical.
You're very welcome to believe that if you like. Personally, I would believe the Chemical Weapons Convention people in The Hague who did the best studies and have proved incontrovertibly that they were Russian chemical weapons used by Syrians. So that's settled.
Do continue.
And your arguments would have more force, as I say, if it wasn't countries in the General Assembly that had stopped action on Rwanda, and if it wasn't countries in the General Assembly that had stopped responsibility to protect. So, as other speakers have said, this is the nature, very sadly, of international politics. But there is no need to throw the whole thing up in the air. As a number of speakers over here said, the League of Nations is fundamentally the reason why the Security Council was created. An additional reason was that President Harry Truman looked at the power of nuclear energy, nuclear power, and decided that a qualitatively different sort of world order and world system was needed to help deal with that. And the Security Council was signed up to by every member of the San Francisco Conference in 1945. It isn't imposed. There are elected members on the Security Council, 10 elected members, and they are chosen by their peers. They put themselves forward. They are chosen by their peers based on regional groupings. So it is not perfect, but let me just say that of the General Assembly, it is very difficult to get 193 members to take action on anything. This isn't a slur on democracy or the General Assembly. It is a fact of life, and I think it's best summed up by a phrase sometimes we used to use of the European Union: everything has been said, but not yet by everybody. If we didn't have, yes?
Russia is a P5, and you're right, they use chemical weapons. What did we do? Russia invaded Ukraine. What have we done? America is a P5, they're doing the genocide in Gaza. What are we doing? So the P5 itself is fundamentally problematic. We're all agreeing on that. And so unless we deal with the P5, the structure of the UN doesn't work.
Russia is particularly problematic. The UN, the General Assembly, could decide, it could turn to the article in the Charter that says if you are a party to a dispute, you should not be voting on it in the Security Council. And the General Assembly could decide that Russia is indeed a party to the Ukraine dispute and should not be voting in the Security Council. But they're never going to do that because the Russians would find ways of punishing them if they did. We're back to the point over here about this is what world politics are like. And as you said, we have to meet world politics where they are. It is not a perfect system. The UN has a noble purpose, but I will be the first to say, having grown up loving the UN, having watched International Rescue and Thunderbirds, the Star Trek Federation logo is based on the United Nations. That's how seminal the the UN was to my world when I was growing up. Without the UN Security Council particularly, there would be no democratic South Korea. There would not have been the Dayton Peace Agreement bringing the war in Bosnia to an end. Yes?
Two examples I think are particularly telling. You mentioned Korea, which only happened because one of the UN Security Council members, Russia, was boycotting it, the exclusion of Communist China. You mentioned the Balkans in the 1990s, when it was UN peacekeepers in Srebrenica who didn't step down. The amount of heads of state the UN peacekeepers have allowed to die. Samuel Doe, Ugingalalia in Rwanda, Mohammed Najibullah in Afghanistan. All these times that nothing has been done.
You're absolutely right, but you're not balancing that with the number of times things have been done. And those are the important things. It isn't perfect. You are not going to have perfection in world politics, but you are going to be able to make progress somewhere. And for those pieces of progress, we need the Security Council with all its imperfections. And for those people who are interested rightly in what happened in Rwanda, I agree. What happened in Rwanda was terrible. The UN did not act. It is one of its greatest failings. It's one of the Security Council's greatest failings. But it did pass the resolutions under Chapter 7, which means it's legally binding on all member states. It passed the resolutions that allowed the war criminals to be brought to account. It tried them and it sent them to jail. The same with Bosnia. Every war crime person indicted in former Yugoslavia is either dead or in jail, and that's a pretty good achievement. Yes?
So fundamentally, your argument and also your the previous speaker's argument rests on the powers of the Security Council, right? The idea of being able to impose sanctions and the idea of being able to send in peacekeepers and have binding resolutions. You're not telling me why the Security Council should have those powers. Sanctions could be imposed through other bodies.
Tell me one other body that can impose sanctions and... But then you'd have a Security Council. The point about the Security... No, you would. Excuse me, you would. Because, and I was coming to this, which is why the war crimes are relevant, the UN Security Council is the only body in the world that can produce executive action, whether it's the use of force, whether it's sanctions, that is legally binding internationally. It can override domestic requirements. Now, you may not like that from a democratic point of view, but it is the only organization that can do that.
My point is not that the Security Council is the only one that can do that. It's just that by saying we're disbanding the Security Council, I'm not saying you should throw out those powers existing somewhere else.
But who would you give them to? Would you give them to the BRICS? Would you want China and Russia alone without the leavening power of democracy to make these decisions? I would not. The UN Security Council is the only body that can do this, and whether you disbanded it and created another one, in the end, you'd have the same thing you started with. You'd have a Security Council or a body authorized under the Charter that every single member of the United Nations has signed up to, and it was voluntary, it wasn't imposed, to agree that the Security Council can behave in that way with what we would call executive action.
When the Security Council was created in 1945, many of the countries that are now independent member states were actually were occupied colonies of the Brits and so forth. So they didn't have much choice. They didn't actually get a signature. They were not they were not states. So the fact that we have the existing permanent five is an anathema, and it's anachronistic compared to the state of the world that we have right now. And suggesting that we disband and create another one would be the same thing is fundamentally flawed, because it wouldn't be the same thing.
Your side are suggesting it, and it's important to realize that it is the same thing, which is why the argument that we disband the council but we keep the powers somewhere actually, in my view, is utterly unworkable. And for the record, countries were consulted in 1945 by the British government, but I also invite you to contemplate that they didn't go and set up a parallel United Nations. They voluntarily, on independence, enabled by the General Assembly and the Security Council. They voluntarily came into the UN that was already created. And the vast numbers of countries in the General Assembly, for all its flaws, and I'm the first to admit it has many, for all its flaws, want the Security Council to work. They trust the Security Council to do its best. That trust is often, I quite agree, often not discharged, but it is a system that has brought a number of benefits to the world. And even now, notwithstanding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, last year it still managed to pass 50 Security Council resolutions about peace processes in Colombia and Libya, about aid going into Sudan, about helping peacekeeping missions that are not blue helmets, not the UN, in Bosnia, Haiti, and Somalia. So it has a really important role to play. I saw in Afghanistan exactly how the Security Council, standing behind the international community, helps the Afghan government do things.
You would call Afghanistan a success?
No, I didn't say it was a success. I'd like you to listen. I said when I was in Afghanistan, and there's a big difference. And I wouldn't say Afghanistan now is a success, but when I was there, things were moving in the right direction, and they were moving in the right direction because the international community stood behind the Afghan government, who was being helped by the UN and was being helped by NATO. And the reason both the UN and NATO could do that was because they were backed by the Chapter 7 powers of the Security Council.
But one of the P5 members sat and negotiated with the Taliban
This.
and handed the country over, so.
You choose whether to accept or decline.
Well, this is kind of how international politics works. And I've already said it isn't perfect. You can imagine another scenario in 2001 when there was an Afghanistan negotiation, and that peace lasted for over 20 years. And I, for one, will freely admit I would have liked it to have lasted longer. But it was backed by the Security Council, and for 20 years, Afghan girls could go to school. Afghanistan had a police force. It had local and central government. It was a lot better than it was pre that time. I want to come on to one last point. Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General, who I admired enormously, Kofi Annan had a great phrase about the Security Council. And he said, together, we have rolled some large rocks up to the top of the mountain, even if some of them have slipped from our grasp and rolled back down. But I am clear that the top of the mountain, with its sweeping vistas and bracing air, is the best place in the world to be. So by all means, reform the Security Council. I'd absolutely sign up for that. But do not disband it. Do not get rid of the one tool that can actually bring about change, imperfectly, but it can do it, through international executive action backed by international law. If you do not do that, then as one speaker over here said, bad leaders will be able to harm their own people even more than they can at present. So imperfect as it is better than nothing.
I just want to understand what you would class as success, because all you've talked about is the successes of the Security Council, but we've heard who actually constituted this council. What actually is the successes? What about the power of the UN Security Council to impose sanctions on countries to actually wield its own imperial power? How do we know that this is not actually just an extension of colonial power because of who constitutes it?
I'm not sure I quite understand you. The Security Council comes together, it sets up a sanctions committee, it recommends what sanctions should be imposed. If you look at what's happening now with Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of Russian overseas money is sanctioned. A lot of Russian business is sanctioned. A lot of Russian access to defense equipment is sanctioned. Things like food and medicine aren't sanctioned. And if you want to argue that more countries should have a say in what those sanctions are, I completely agree with you. And sanctions committees are usually open for that reason. They have provisions so that you can have a peace process and individuals can travel to those peace processes. But I don't think you'll find many people in the UN today who would not support those sanctions on Russia. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for that round of paper speeches, and indeed to all of our speakers this evening. Just a few brief notices before we vote. So, if I can ask you once you vote to just immediately head towards the orator to the bar where the results will be announced. There's the opportunity to speak to and challenge any speakers that you would like to in the orator. But please don't swarm them here. We've had a bit of a chokehold issue in the past few weeks. Winter ball tickets are still on sale. And on that note, I think the free ball ticket goes to the gentleman from Clare Hall over there. So see me after. Congratulations.